Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's not often I get a chance to talk about one of my favorite subjects, so today I get to talk about Giga technology and also the Gigaton problem. Now, Giga is a billion, just so you know. The reason that we focus on Giga technology, because these are the largest systems in which humans manipulate mass and energy. And so if you really want to find targets of opportunity for a more sustainable future, this is a good place to look. I want to talk a little bit about since I was talking to Jason about equations, because it's all about, at Princeton, did you develop an equation? So I got a couple I was going to share with you. First, I was mentioned that Princeton's legacy, we know about the Advanced Study Institute, and the state of Georgia has what's called the Georgia Research Alliance, and patterned after the Advanced Study Institute, hopefully to draw in scholars who make tremendous contributions like Albert Einstein did. And I'm an eminent scholar, GRA, eminent scholar. Okay, so I got a few slides here that talk about our search for fundamental equations and algorithms. Okay, here's one. First one is we developed an algorithm that can solve 100 million stiff ordinary differential equations on my laptop in 35 minutes. That's got to be noteworthy. We developed many algorithms to solve 2- and 3-phase flow problems that describe advection, dispersion, reaction, adsorption, catalysis, and bioconversion, and involve solving simultaneous hyperbolic and parabolic partial differential equations. The last one from this slide is we developed what's called graph theory to predict reaction pathway networks for advanced oxidation technologies. This actually has, as a program written, took 3 years, 20,000 lines written in C++. Basically what you do is you represent a molecule as a graph, and then you have another molecule that reacts with it. In this case, we have 4 different molecules. I'm not going to get into it in detail, but anyway, then we have reaction rules, and these reaction rules are shown here. And as a result, we end up with this mathematical abstraction, kind of patterned after Euclid's idea of graph theory, which allows us to predict all the byproducts that might be formed. Another one that we worked on was, it's well known that for parakinetic or flocculation of small particles, that the normalized particle size distribution remains a constant. What happens after they grow large enough, then the only way you can get those particles to flocculate or emerge with one another is to add some advection or mixing. And what we did is we developed an equation, which is shown, these equations are shown here. The value of the mixing intensity as a function of time that's required that would cause the particle size distribution to remain the same. The idea is this: if you can keep the particle size distribution the same, then it's easier to remove those particles later on, because you don't have really small ones, you don't have really big ones. You just have the same size or the same distribution. So, another one, which is interesting, this is patterned after the Stokes-Einstein equation. For small particles, they move around in a random way. And what we did is we developed this method to predict how fast they would agglomerate. And we use this Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution to get the energy distribution. And then when the 2 particles come together, they repel one another. And we calculate that repulsion using DBLO theory. And then a certain fraction of these particles have enough energy to overcome that resistance that they're both negatively charged, and then they flocculate. So anyway, and this is a little diagram that shows the attachment efficiency model versus the data. What else do I have here? Okay. Another one is mixing. So another thing we worked on is mixing. So when you mix a fluid, you can't necessarily mix everything together and make it homogeneous. There's certain criteria. And there's a thing called the Kolmogorov size. For a certain amount of energy you put in, this is the smallest eddy size. And so you can get good mixing at larger scales, but inside these smaller eddies, you've got to have diffusion to take place. And so this is from my book, basically there's a product of this mixing intensity and time. If it's greater than 247, I didn't have to forgot to call it the Crittenden number, but if it's greater than 247, then you would get uniform mixing through the entire fluid. This is more relevant to what we're talking about today. We try to develop the governing equations. Governing equations for power generation. Here's the deal. Here's the deal. One second here. Maybe I don't have to use this. Can anyone hear me anyway? Okay. So what we're trying to do is work on what's called distributed power generation, and it involves the pieces that are shown here. What we have is what's called a prime mover. That prime mover could be one of these several classes of things, such as a gas turbine, fuel cell, reciprocating engines, microturbines, steam turbines, and the like. And they produce power and heat. Anyway, what we're trying to do is we use that to cover the building demand for power as well as for heat. And there's a little complication here. We might have too much heat, so we can store it. Then we can use this heat from the prime mover in an absorption chiller, which you can convert it into cooling, which you can then cool the building. You can heat the building directly like this, or you might have, from the grid, we have this supplying some power and heat as well. So anyway, if you look at all this, it's kind of complicated, and we're never going to be able to understand it. I assume this is kind of a lay audience, but what we did is we developed a set of equations that describe this whole thing as a unit, and here's the answer. This is the waste heat value. And what we want to do when we design this decentralized power generation device is don't waste any energy or try to waste as little heat as possible. And so here's my equation based on the operation of these devices. So we can try to minimize the waste heat. That's an objective. Okay, back to the main topic today. So the first thing is I want to talk about sustainability and what the Gigaton problem is. We don't see much art discussed in the context of sustainability, so I grabbed this for your consideration. This is one of the 4 paintings that Munch painted called The Scream, and it goes like this. And this one, in particular, was sold recently for $120 million, and it came with a little poem. I was walking along a path with 2 friends. The sun was setting, and suddenly the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence, and there was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety as I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. So my little interpretation is nature's scream. I cannot provide the resources you need in a sustainable way. We'll follow on that in a minute. So to kind of simplify what we can do as an engineer, I tried to set forth a couple of goals that we might want to approach. And basically we can say we need to recreate the anthroposphere. That's a place where we live that exists within the means of nature, and that's a very simple statement, but it has 2 components. One component is, that is, we have to use renewable resources that nature provides, and the second part is we don't want to generate any more waste that nature cannot, or overwhelm natural cycles. And then, of course, we also need to generate knowledge and technology to improve the environment and the human condition. And this is going to require us to examine the interactions between the natural, engineered, social, and economic systems. I'll do a little bit of that in this talk. So let's talk a little bit about the first premise of sustainability. Generate waste that nature can assimilate. And to really answer this question thoroughly, I'd have to look at a lot of things: toxic components, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, and so on, and carbon. And I'll just focus on carbon. It's in the news. You can understand it. It's pretty easy. So the window, I just want to point out, the window for taking action is rapidly closing for a 1.5 to 2 degree scenario. And this is our gigaton budget. See, now we start talking about billions of tons. Gigaton budget that we have, and if we exceed this, then we're going to have a higher temperature than 2 degrees Celsius. And then we have a percentile here, the 50th percentile. If we take that, the likely place we really are, we would have only about 15 years left, assuming that we have constant emissions from today. So we have to do something quickly. Second premise of sustainability we talked about is using renewable resources. And I'll look at materials. I'll look at the waste problem. That's what I got here for you. So this is waste. And here's what the waste composition is. And this is in 2016. A big piece is food waste, paper, cardboard, plastic, glass, metal, rubber, wood, and other. Here's the thing that's really important and why we're failing this gigaton problem. 84 billion tons or gigatons of material are consumed annually in the world economy, and only 9% is renewed. That's going to make a big landfill. I did the calculation. After 1,000 years, and you spread it evenly across the United States, it'd be 1 meter deep, or something like that. That's a big landfill. So we're going to have a circular economy, or we're going to be swimming in it. I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about ag. And first we'll just start with unsustainable animal farming. First and foremost, it's really important for you to realize that basically one third of all ice-free land is used for cattle raising. 1/3. They emit a huge amount of greenhouse gases, and then here's the demands for water and energy. Here we have for a chicken, how much feed we need, how much water we need to create 1 kilogram of chicken. And this is the amount of feed you need for a pig, the amount of water that you need as well. And then for beef, it's the worst one. To get 1 kilogram of meat, you need 10 kilograms of feed, this much water. And moving forward, we can see there's a huge or growing appetite for animal-based foods. So there's this whole new dimension that's coming on the scene. It's called green food, where we're going to make sustainable meat and dairy products from plants. And it turns out we have somewhere around 40,000 species of plants, and each one has tens of thousands of protein. So these tech startups we should be able to see out there coming soon, and we do have some available already, where you're mimicking the taste of animal-derived plants and include having enormous efficiency in terms of energy, water, and other inputs. And here's some examples already that are out there. Beyond Meat has this plant-based chicken strips. They're pretty good, actually. Eggless mayonnaise. I'm sure you may have heard of these Impossible burgers. I actually had one that tastes better, in my opinion, than Kobe beef. And then beverage that is a complete substitute for food. This guy invented this soy lentil drink, which you can just take a couple times a day, and that satisfies all your nutritional needs. And so the originator, the person who developed this, decided not to have a kitchen. He turned his kitchen into a library, and then once in a while he goes out for recreational dining, he calls it. There's another company which is kind of cool. It's called NotCo. And NotCo uses artificial intelligence, named Giuseppe. I don't know if you know the background for Giuseppe, but basically you have this thing that looks like a human that's made out of vegetables. And that's why they called it Giuseppe, the platform. But anyway, it analyzes and replicates animal-based foods based at the molecular level. And they're trying to recreate the same sensory experience, such as the colors, flavors, textures, and so on. And their current products are shown here. Not milk, not mayo, not cream, not milk, not meat. And they're currently working on not tuna. Okay, Gigaton Problem, here we go. So this is my report card, the report card. We need to tick the box off. We've got to put a dent in some of these numbers here. I just want to mention that we said this before already, how many gigatons of material we're using. 9% is only renewable. And so if we go across go across here, we have about 7.7 billion people, 84 billion or gigatons of material being used. Energy use in terms of gigatons of oil equivalent per year, we're talking 16.2, only 18% renewable. Carbon output from fossil fuels, about 10 gigatons. The amount of water, we have 400,000 billion cubic meters of water. It's roughly 43% of the available fresh water. And the other problem, we have billion passenger cars. The other problem is plastics. Soon, we may see more plastic in the ocean than fish. Got to be a problem with that. I forget how far in the future that forecast is. But we have made something like 8.3 billion tons of virgin plastic to date. And we have 6.3 gigatons of plastic waste. Only 9% is recyclable, a lot of it is incinerated, and lots of it in the natural environment as well as in landfills. So going back to this problem of how much resources we're using, I wanted to point out that the golden billion, people like you and I, are the ones who are using this much resource and generating this much waste. And when we think about 2050, and we have everyone with the same lifestyle, multiply it by 9. So we really have to do something here. All right. Okay, so let's see what we can do. Let's talk about creating more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. I don't have to say too much about cities and how important they are, but you can see how much greenhouse gas they emit and how much natural resources, and currently how many live in cities worldwide versus the US, and then the global energy use and the global GDP. A lot of it's happening inside of cities. And we know that, according to UNEP, we're going to require $90 trillion of investment by 2030. And the thing is, infrastructure that we build lasts a very long time. So once we build it, we have to live with it. And so that's an important problem because 90%, 80 to 90% of its impact occurs during the use phase, not during the construction phase. We are seeing some interesting activities out there, kind of forcing the issue. In 2014, farmers paid insurance claims resulting from storms a year later around Chicago. And so they sued the city of Chicago. Hey, you know climate has changed, and you didn't design the storm sewers adequately? Well, they eventually did drop the lawsuit, but certainly that's a shot over the bow when we start talking about planning for the future. Either sea level rise or flooding, you have to take that into consideration. Okay, so we can build infrastructures that are more sustainable and resilient and create more wealth and comfort. But how? That's the fundamental question. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I think I have a few answers I'll share with you today. First thing I want to say is that integration has not really come to infrastructure. We build our infrastructures in somewhat of a siloed way. We don't think about how they might interact with one another and how we can build this as a system of systems and then use less resources and create more comfort and wealth without generating more waste and investing more resources. That's the main thing. So we have this transdiscipline we've been talking about. It's called infrastructure ecology. We view a city as a complex, adaptive ecosystem comprised of physical, material, and human infrastructures. And what we're trying to do is reorder the system of systems, reduce energy and resource flows, and drive the creation of infrastructure, increase wealth, comfort, while fostering sustainable, equitable, and resilient cities. So there's a couple ways we're looking at this: improving the diversity of the infrastructure and integrating socioeconomic dynamics such as stakeholders and governance into the equation as well. The new design imperative is not to make this building, I mean, it's certainly nice to have a platinum building, great. But what we really want to look at is the emergent properties at the highest level, right? Why would you design a transportation network that would create poor air quality? Doesn't sound like a good idea. So those are the emergent properties that we want to have, and they're listed over here on the left. You know, creating more of a sense of community, improving the quality of life, lower mortality rates, and improved economy. Those are all things we want. And this is all driven by the interaction of three things: citizens, governmental institutions, as well as the infrastructure itself. So those interactions hopefully creating these emergent properties that are desirable as opposed to undesirable ones shown over here on the right. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the water energy nexus, land use, and a couple other things, and some technological options that can convince you that we're trying to make progress. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on this decentralized energy production. I want to give you a picture of what it looks like. This is the Perkins and Will Atlanta office. They're an architectural firm. It's about 4,500 square foot in this building, and they're using air-cooled microturbines for heating and cooling. And so it looks like this. This is what the microturbines look like. They generate heat. You can use that heat for heating the building, and they also generate power, because that's one of the demands here. We want to produce power, and we can use more of the energy that is of the fuel that goes into this, because now we're not wasting the heat like at a centralized plant far, far away. We evaporate water to reject heat. And then you can also take the heat from this and run it through what's known as an absorption chiller during the summertime and cool the building. Well, anyway, as a distributed generation as part of the grid, this is how much water and energy, this is how much water, CO2, and NOx we can reduce using this technology. And you're going to see some more of this in a moment. One thing you probably haven't really thought about is what causes sprawl. And we did an analysis of 180 cities in the United States, and we looked at what's called the fractal dimension. And let me just say what the fractal dimension is briefly. But the fractal dimension is measured how easy, so if you say this is your city, it measures how fast you can get across a city. So as the fractal dimension increases, yeah, this is Washington, right? As the fractal dimension increases, you can see here on the right there, it's easier to get around and get more sprawl. And when you have more sprawl, this is the carbon footprint, and this is metric tons per capita per year in Atlanta. So this is Atlanta. It's about the same size as the Beltway. This is around Washington, D.C. And you can see the carbon footprint is substantially less, and this fractal dimension is a lot lower. There's lots of other reasons, but the point is maybe this is certainly something we want to think about. We don't want to make it so convenient that we can cause sprawl and have a higher carbon footprint for our transportation network. Okay, I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about this, so I won't spend much time on it. But basically, low impact development, reducing stormwater runoff, erosion, and surface water contaminants, and some of the best practices are shown here. You know, this is a green alleyway where water goes back to the surface water. They have wetland upstream where we can treat stormwater, rainwater harvesting, forest pavement, green roofs, rain gardens, and so on. There is an interdependency between water infrastructure and the socioeconomic environment. I don't know if you've thought about this much, but this is a graph for the city of Philadelphia. They say that the benefit is about $4.5 billion if they completely change everything over to LID for 100% runoff. And the categories you can see here is increased recreational opportunities, improved aesthetics and property values, reduction in heat stress mortality, and so on. When you add it all up, we're talking for 100% implementation is about $4.5 billion. Now, you probably haven't thought about this one. There's a connection between autonomous vehicles and stormwater, and this is how it goes. We did this estimate for the city of Atlanta. So if we have 80% penetration of autonomous vehicles, we only have 28% of the cars we need today. This requires us to reduce the parking space that's needed, and as a result, we have a reduction in impervious area and stormwater runoff. And we end up with about 17% of additional city land for green space and stormwater management. Okay, so the other tool that we can use, you've heard about Internet of Things. What are you going to do with the Internet of Things? And what we have been working on is using the Internet of Things to describe our campus using what's called a digital twin. Let me explain to you what a digital twin is. Digital twin is not a cyber representation of a fixed object. A digital twin, well, let's take the example of two aircraft engines. When they're first created, they're the same. Great. But then when they go into service, they're in different have a different airplane, different maintenance, different time, everything like that. So those digital twins change over time, and we use sensors to try to understand how that digital twin is changing over time. So for example, you might measure vibration, which then says, hey, guess what, you're gonna have a problem with your jet engine, so you better replace it, or you better do some maintenance on it. So that's a digital twin, as opposed to some cyber representation of a physical object. So what we're trying to do is create a smart community of a city and Internet of Things, so sensors around to understand current conditions and improve the sustainability of this existing infrastructure, as well as think about how we might improve it in the future by adding more infrastructure. That's what this point is here. Evaluate the sustainability performance of adding additional technologies such as decentralized energy and water production. And so at the end of the day, what we're going to use a digital twin is to create a more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So what does our digital twin look like? First and foremost, I want you to know that it's a multi-layer of systems, human activities, built environment, water, ecological or environmental footprint, security, mobility, infrastructure, IT infrastructure, supply chain, and ecological services. Those are the layers. So that's what the campus is and what we're looking at. And then on this side, the processes and people. So people, okay, of course, you understand we have faculty and students and researchers, administrators, parking management, so on, OIT. And then there's processes that are going on at the university, such as education research, event planning, asset tracking, finding fault and diagnostics, and so on. So these interact with one another, and we gather this data, and this is our digital twin of the campus. So at the end of the day, we can create a smarter infrastructure of autonomous, self-aware, self-optimized, and self-healing infrastructure. I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And over here, we're going to empower people using the tools to enhance the human perception and decision-making. So that's what our digital twin of the campus looks like. We have various levels that we can talk about, including, I think I covered this already, human activity, building systems, and campus-wide activities. All right, wow. So the digital twin has 4 important components that are shown here. One is descriptive, next is diagnostic, next is predictive, and the last one is prescriptive. So this one is like what is happening? What happened? What is happening? Next one is, why did it happen? The next one is, what is likely to happen? And so if something happens, how do you act in response to that? So those are the 4 major components for the digital twin. So here we have several buildings over time, and we've got it nicely colored here. It looks like there's a problem here with this building in terms of heating, and this is for the descriptive. You know, what happened? That's what we're trying to figure out here. So we can track these buildings over time and then decide what we can do to fix it. And then, by the way, this is a secondary pump power that's used across campus to move things around water. And this is before using the digital twin. That's a cloud of data there. It's not important for you to know other than there's more power up here. And then after tuning this, we were able to reduce the amount of water or power that's required for sump pumps. So the value proposition is shown here. Common operating picture for team discussion, cost avoidance, and identifying inefficiencies. Okay, so now this shows around the clock. It might be a little confusing. Here we have 6 a.m., 12 a.m., 6 p.m., and 12 p.m. And what we have here is this little ring right in here is, we've got 2 rings here. That's the cooling load in tons of ice. We were talking to somebody earlier about the tons of ice earlier. And what we can see here, this is the heating in tons, and here we have cooling in tons. And when you look at this building, you say to yourself, there's something wrong here, because the cooling tons is almost, in the winter, that's this one, representative winter days, winter weather. It's almost the same as the summer days, which is this other line right here. And you say, wow, summer days, it's really it's really not too much different. So there's a problem here. We need to fix this. So you can get these signatures to identify performance and what the root causes are. So this is for a variety of different buildings. And this one you can see, whoa, something's really going on there. And especially if you look at this one, the heating, it's just jumping up and down. So this indicates that the controls need some tuning, for example. So this one is, why did it happen? Some diagnostic work. Okay, let me see here. This one, the last one. Okay, so in predictive, no time to get into the details here. We have these calibrated models, physics-based models to forecast loads for chiller demand. We're going to think of heating and a lot of other infrastructure things as well. And what we need to do is what's going to happen in the future. So what we do is we look at the weather forecast, and based on the weather forecast, I can decide how I buy my fuels. And we can save a lot of money this way, because fuels could cost 1,000 times more. And if you have some idea how much fuel you need and where it's coming from, you can plan for the future. The last one is prescriptive. I'm running out of time here. What we talk about with prescriptive is that we're given the weather forecast and cooling demand. How should we operate those optimally, those chillers? And if a chiller went down, this is the last one, prescriptive. A chiller went down unexpectedly. What can we do to curtail the load and not have as large of an impact? And I didn't mention that we had thousands and thousands of campus sensors across campus, and we have cameras, we have motion detectors, we even have CO2 detectors. So I know how many people are in this room with the CO2 detector. Okay. What I want to do now is talk about this last item, managing complexity and trying to put it all together. Hold on here. First of all, I want you to, I guess everyone is maybe familiar with Manufacturing 4.0. Manufacturing 4.0 is about what you know, not what you make. And the cost model now is that these examples are that the tech giants rule, because they'll get the revenue, they get most of the revenue, and they can use this to look at this to understand market data, supply chain data, performance data, and so on. And they have the money, so they can ask Metal Basher A versus Metal Basher B, I want you to make these things for me. One more, let's give an example. For example, Apple doesn't make the iPhone. Only 5% of the revenue from the use of the Apple phone is given back to Foxconn, who makes the iPhone, as one example. Android system, they give it away. But they get the lion's share of the money. So we have this platform idea, and that's what we're trying to focus on, is develop this platform and allow you to simulate the future. And the three pieces are going to be, first, stakeholder engagement. And based on stakeholder engagement, we then begin to know what the demand is for infrastructure. There's a platform that we can use to evaluate the performance of that infrastructure, and then we can move forward to try and move forward to create more sustainable infrastructure. So we've identified really more than 50 and even more technologies, and if you put it into this platform and what I will call multidisciplinary design optimization, and I'll show you what that is in a moment. You put all those together in this analysis, and the potential synergistic effects would improve air quality and health, living environment, larger share of renewables in the energy mix, reduced vehicle miles traveled, even increases in tax revenue. Okay, returning to the power issue. I didn't really have time to do a good job on this. The ratio of power production to fuel usage for centralized power ranges about 29% for conventional coal-fired power plants. 60 is a little high. I got a better number coming up in a minute for combined cycle natural gas, and heat is wasted. So here's your centralized power plants a long ways away from your buildings, which need cooling and heating, which you can recover this heat for cooling and heating. So here's your building demands, and this is the conventional or centralized way. Here are the buildings here. They need power for air conditioning and for heating, So we're going to supply power for air conditioning. And then we have a boiler or a boiler, for example, that will burn natural gas or oil that will create the heat that we need for the building. So that's the conventional approach. And I showed this to you before, maybe it's a little frightening, but we'll get a second chance to look at this. The ratio of power to heat, power and heat to fuel energy is about 85%. And this is a little complicated diagram. We might use some grid energy that feeds into the AC bus that's shown here, that supplies power to the buildings. We also have what's called prime mover, this distributed version. It could be a gas turbine, fuel cell, reciprocating engine, microturbine, or steam turbine. And that'll supply heat for the building. If we have too much heat, we could store it, for example, here. And if we need, we can also use that heat and run it through this absorption chiller. I showed you a picture of one. And that'll create cooling. And then we have this power that we could use to create air conditioning, changing electricity into electricity into cooling. So that's what the whole thing looks like. And then over here on the right, we have wind power can feed in. We have photovoltaics. We have battery storage, for example. We could have pumped hydro storage, compressed air, and so on. So there's all these different, these are some definitions of some things I'm showing here. But anyway, so our idea is to put together this combination that'll have very little waste heat and use almost all the energy that's in the fuel. And this shows you the energy for distributed energy. So this is for coal, petroleum, natural gas, and this is for our systems. This is for Duluth, Minnesota, matching the energy efficiency. You get about 72%. And a medium office in Phoenix using fuel cell-based system, we get about 85% efficiency. So now what about this multidisciplinary design optimization? There's two factors. This is the main thing we're trying to look at. This is this function of life cycle cost and life cycle assessment. And it's a function of building type, climate zone, the technologies that we use, the sizes and operation. That's what that function looks like. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like. The environmental sustainability performance includes damages to ecosystem and related resource availability, like reducing the amount of fuel that's available. And the LCA units are in the percent of increased impacts of a citizen per year. Anyway, this requires many disciplines, hence we call this the multidisciplinary design optimization. I'm going to give you a little bit about what the LCA scores are. So these are the impact categories that we're looking at. And this is how much is produced by, on average, per person. We divide that number into the increase in that as a result of trying this technology. And then we weight it according to this. Most of the weighting is, goes by an LCA expert for global warming, and this is done with what's called analytic hierarchical processing. But anyway, multiply this all together, and we get a single score. Give you a little bit background on it. Okay, so the other thing that we look at is parametric life cycle assessment, or life cycle costing, and there's the economic costs. So some of the important assumptions are shown here. 7% discount rate, and net present value constant, 2019 dollars. Anyway, so you can look at some of our implementation of our ideas here. You can see that, I don't have time to explain the graph, but what we see here is that the global warming impact has been reduced by 32 to 46%. And this is the water consumption reduced by 70 to 98%. This is for a medium-sized office in Atlanta. And okay, so acidification can be reduced, fossil fuel depletion can be reduced. All right, great. This one is for a Miami office, and you'll notice I didn't say, this is the Pareto front. So we're making these thousands of, actually a billion calculations. We're looking at a billion calculations, we're looking at all these options, and we calculate the life cycle single score and the life cycle cost. Remember, that's that function that we were looking at. And behind here, we have thousands of, billions of combinations of these different technologies: fuel cell wind compressed air storage, fuel cell solar battery, fuel cell solar compressed air, blah, blah, blah. No reason for us to study this in detail. what we do is we look at all the combinations that I showed here earlier. Sky, lots of different technologies and lots of options, and when we do that we get this Pareto front where we have cost basically per square foot, and then the impact single score over on this side. And over here what we are looking at is using basically combined cooling, heat and power, the micro turbine. And over here what we're getting lower scores are with a solid oxide catalyst over here. And we can get a lot lower score. And then this is the number that we want to compare it to for centralized power. Life cycle cost is $3 per square foot, and it's way over here, right? Like over there. So the cost is a lot less for the centralized power. However, the life cycle single score is up there. So we're doing a lot better by looking at these alternatives. And that's the other thing we've not been talking about, and that is what you should call, or what I should call, externalities of cost. This is the cost that's not included in your energy production. It's only the cost in producing. But the pollutants that go out there and cause harm and health problems, that's reflected in this life cycle single score. And we're doing a lot better than the centralized power. I'm not going to talk about this, but there's a way to figure that out, the social cost of these pollutants. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is modeling adoption and sustainability performance. We developed this agent-based model prediction of growth, and then based on the prediction, we look at the performance of decentralized combined cooling, heat, and power. In this case, we haven't been as exhaustive in looking at the multidisciplinary design optimization options. We only had one. We use microturbines only, and then at the end try to estimate air quality. Okay, so here it goes. So the first thing is to develop this agent-based model. We collect data, like social media, blogs, news, and so on. Then we analyze this information to understand sentiment analysis. And then from there, we use this to develop a market-based, agent-based model. That's how we do it. So what we have is this data, smart track data for Atlanta. We have data on 1.3 million parcels in 13 counties here in metropolitan Atlanta. And this is really pixelized, so you really can't see what we know. But if I push the button here, now you can see when we focus in, this is the kind of information we have on those parcels. We know sales price, land value, estimated square feet, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, from this information, we can then begin to predict the energy demand of the entire city of Atlanta and how it might change over time, and then calculate whether we're going to solve this Gigaton problem that I've been talking about. Okay, so here we go. This work was started with a base year of 2005, and then this is business as usual. I don't know if you can really see it that well, but the yellow is going wider and wider. That's single-family homes. We're getting more sprawl. And then over here we have more compact growth, and you can see that the yellow and red, it's about the same. We're just having it more compact growth. The one thing I wanted to say is that when we did the analysis of the building energy use, for business as usual and for more compact growth, as you might expect, it didn't make a huge difference. Really, we need to consider the transportation component to this, so the carbon footprint for transportation for this, and the carbon footprint for transportation for more compact growth. But that was beyond the scope of what we could do, so we just focused on buildings. And here's what we found. This is CO2 in tons, 10 to the 6 tons. And this is the 2005 level. And with CCHP, we only were able to drop that 8%. But if we had net metering with the grid, we could drop it 50%, actually below the 2005 level. In terms of NOx, which is a precursor for PM 2.5, we can see that we can get 63% reduction in NOx with CCHP added, and then 90% reduction with net metering. And water is another big one. You can see how much water we reduce, the water that's demand. And this is evaporative loss, consumption, as opposed to take it out, put it back in the river. Consumption is water that's gone forever. And you can see that we can reduce the water demand almost 250 million gallons per day, and maybe even more when we have CCHP with net metering. Let me say another thing. We're talking about putting in on the order of 300,000 microturbines, so kind of blue skying it for Atlanta. And it did cost less, about $1 billion less per year. Here we are. This is what I was looking for. The water for energy consumption reduced by 315 million gallons a day if we go from there down to there. And here's the important thing, my report card. Remember I was talking about my report card for data technology? Here we can see that we could reduce the CO2 emissions by 0.016 gigatons. So imagine doing that in hundreds of cities, you might really make a huge dent. Okay. And then air quality. How does the air quality change? And you may or may not know this, there's 3 things you need for ozone: NOx, VOCs, volatile organic chemicals, and sunlight. And you can see it's changing depending on the time of day. When it's nighttime, we get smaller ozone levels, and during the day, you're getting red, which is, we're exceeding the EPA's non-attainment values of 80 parts per billion. And this little thing right here, that's the perimeter. We've seen it in a couple other graphs. Okay. Now, one thing, I get a lot of times questions about, hey, what about the cost of all this? And what's the value proposition? And I just got to say one thing. There's one force that's stronger than Mother Nature, and that's Father of Profit, right? Father of Profit. Okay, so here you can see California. First of all, I want to say California is the 5th largest economy in the world. And here's the GDP growth since 2010. And this is the GDP growth of the United States. And you can see there's a huge gap there, about 10%. So what are they doing differently? Well, they got a lot of things here. Every house has to have a solar panel. Minimum wage, strict auto emissions, and so on. And so we're getting investments in these more renewable, renewable resources, renewable energy, and so on. So it doesn't necessarily have to cost more. It might create more opportunity. So a lot of times I get this question, so are you a pessimist or an optimist? And I've identified myself as a pragmatic possibilist, so we'll talk about that. Also, this is sort of the summary of what I've kind of gone over here. Urban systems are all connected, and more efficiency can be achieved by looking at their interactions. Looks like decentralized energy and combined cooling, heat, and power could save energy and water. Your land use planning is a tool that's vital in reducing the impact of urban systems and examining their interactions. And maybe these agent-based models would be useful to determine the adoption rate of different infrastructure systems and how it might respond to different policy instruments. I also think digital twins are quite useful to create smarter cities that can improve sustainability and resilience for performance and allow us to test new technologies. With that, thank you for your attention. I know I covered a lot of ground. There'll be a test tomorrow.
Hi. Hi. You mentioned fuel cells a little bit in passing, and I understand the efficiency are supposed to be quite good and less emissions, but it seems like the microturbines have a cost analysis. Are there any emissions associated with the microturbines, and what's the analysis of those 2 technologies in sort of package power plants?
Yeah, well, the microturbines, there's an important parameter. It's called heat to power ratio, and the solid oxide catalyst technology creates more power and less heat. Now, why is that important? I'll explain why that's important. You try to make this building as energy efficient as possible, so you don't want to lose heat during the winter or have more cooling. So when you're trying to match the power load of the building with the solid oxide catalyst, you don't have to worry as much because you won't have too much excess heat. Now, the microturbines, they produce more heat power, and that's the problem. Okay, in terms of NOx production, I have to look at the details, but as I recall, the solid oxide catalyst did not produce as many pollutants as the microturbines. And there's a bunch of other options. I'm sorry, I tried to cover too much here. Let's just look at the diagram here, as long as we're talking. This one. So here are the prime mover options: gas turbines, fuel cells, reciprocating engines, and microturbines and steam turbines. And there's HPR, that's the heat power ratio for all of these. And you can see that the fuel cells are pretty good compared to some of the others. Anyway, I don't have the pollution that's there, but the fuel cells produce less NOx. And anyway, if we can recover almost all the energy that comes in as the fuel, then our carbon footprint for that particular set of combinations will be smaller. And that's what we showed. Others?
Have you analyzed the cost of carbon and how that will affect and drive what you're presenting here?
Thanks for asking. I had to skip over it. Let's see here. Maybe. No, let me see here. I think it's later. Anyway, we did look at the social cost of carbon, and depending on where you are, there, I actually have about 15 slides that look at this. So there was this model that we were able to run that would simulate the impacts of air pollution. And the pollutants that we were looking at was ammonia, NOx, VOCs, PM2.5, and so on. And this is the NOx levels. And the reason I didn't show this is I didn't have a detailed picture here. But anyway, I'm using this and the grid locations, there's like 12 sectors here. You can calculate the existing situation for those 12 sectors. And the buildings that we looked at were, for example, we looked at Atlanta, Chicago, Duluth, Minnesota, Miami, and Phoenix. So we looked at those different locations. And the grid mix gives you different pollutants. And this is what it looks like for NOx in 2014. Anyway, so we can calculate, based on the health impacts, what the cost of these different pollutants might be, and by implementing the technology that we're talking about here, how much we could reduce, how could you reduce that social cost as opposed to putting in, more, because before implementation of technology, we have one value for those different pollutants, and then after implementation, the pollutants concentrations are lower, and we can estimate the social cost of that. So we did do a little bit of that. But we are moving forward. We're going to actually do air quality modeling in those cities to figure out what the health impacts would be. And it's a little dicey to take health impacts and then start thinking about what is the value of asthma or that type of thing. But at least we have some idea of the human health impact and the externalities.
Thanks. Do you collaborate with NRG or locally? And then I had a follow-up on the Impossible Burger. I know you said that you enjoyed your experience, with respect to the soy product, the beet joy juice, and some of the other what you consider negative qualities. Which one, the NRG?
Huh?
NRG Energy, do you collaborate with NRG?
No.
Oh. About the Impossible Burger, you touched on that early. Yeah, what are some of the negatives? You hear some of the negatives to that. What are your
Well, some
comments?
people are asking the questions that help you. And that's something important. They tend to add a lot of oil, so I don't know. That's the next part of it. There has been some life cycle assessments. I skipped over it, but I think eating one Impossible Burger saves 25 square foot of land because you have to grow a cow. Also, I think it was a 15-minute shower. You can save water for 15-minute showers. They didn't do the life cycle assessment, but anyway, it's an interesting thing. Moving forward, think of it this way: we have 1/3 of the high-speed land for animal husbandry right now, and only 1 billion people are eating all that meat. So think about it: if we were to have 9 times that, it's not workable because we don't have 2.7 Earth. High-speed land on Earth, so that's going to be a problem. Okay.
NRG. NRG, the public company?
No, I don't know. We haven't worked with them.
Okay.
All right.
Hi, why are you using a 7% discount rate? That seems pretty high. And is it user adjustable?
I know. I think after 20 years, you're still paying about 30% after 20 years, but still, anyway. Sometimes I want a 100% discount rate, so you get the tax credit of the entire investment. Anyway.
Your last slide showed design elements of Georgia Tech building with many facets for energy efficiency. As a homeowner, I have to ask myself whether putting in something like a solar panel, whether Father Profit is going to be stronger than Mother Nature. How long does that building have to be in existence before those energy efficiency facets pay out?
Okay, so which facets were you specifically talking about?
Well, you have the roof design, you've got the patio design. I don't remember, but I just remember seeing there were a number of energy efficient facets put into the design of the building. And so I'm just wondering, how long does the building have to be in existence before you get your money back?
Well, that could be looked at as the life cycle cost. I mean, that's the cost from $2,900. And so you compare that to what the life cycle cost might be for an alternative. And I think I touched on that briefly, and a lot of other things briefly. For example, this is the one of different technology options. And this is the Fractal front. That's the lowest possible life cycle score, as well as this is the lowest life cycle cost in dollars per foot. Anyway, so yeah. And here you can see that the cost is, that minimum there is about $16 per square foot, which is quite high compared to $3 per square foot for centralized power. And I guess another way to look at it being a little bit, it's like pejorative. Yeah. You know, what is the value of human life, or what is the value of avoided asthma? I don't know.
All right, with that, thanks again, John.